Nobody expected a 21-year-old from Quezon City to shake the entire tennis world in one single week. She grew up training with her brother and her grandfather after school, in ruffled socks and light-up shoes. Now she was standing on center court at Wimbledon, staring down a Grand Slam champion. What happened next would rewrite Philippine sports history forever. This is the story of Eala and the week that changed everything. Every legend starts somewhere small. For Eala, it started on modest courts in Quezon City, far from the manicured lawns of the All England Club. She wasn't born into tennis royalty. She was a kid who trained after school, day after day, alongside her brother and her grandfather, not chasing headlines, just chasing the ball, again and again, in the kind of quiet repetition that never makes it into highlight reels, but is the foundation of every great career. The Philippines is not a nation known for producing Grand Slam contenders. Basketball dominates the national conversation. Boxing has its heroes. But tennis? Tennis had never truly had its moment. Not until a determined teenager left home to train at the Nadal Academy, thousands of miles away, betting everything on a sport that offered no guarantees and no shortcuts. That bet started to pay off in ways few could have predicted. By 2026, Eala was no longer just a promising junior with potential. She was a fixture on the WTA Tour, grinding through challenger events, then 125s, then the main tour itself. And this season, something shifted. In June 2026, she captured the WTA 125 Birmingham title, a signal that her game was rounding into peak form. She followed it with a run to the semifinals of the Berlin Open, a 500-level event, proving that her results weren't a fluke, they were a pattern. Still, none of it fully prepared the tennis world, or the Philippines, for what was coming. Grass courts had always been considered her weakest surface, the one where her game seemed least suited to thrive. And yet, heading into Wimbledon 2026, there was a quiet confidence building around her. Whether it was a slower serve finally suiting the surface, or simply a newfound maturity in her game, something had clicked. She arrived at the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club not as a headline name, but as a 21-year-old with career-high momentum and nothing to lose. Few outside of dedicated tennis circles knew her name. Fewer still could have imagined that within days, an entire nation would be organizing watch parties just to see her play. But that's the thing about history. It rarely announces itself in advance. It creeps up in early rounds, in routine wins, in small signs that something bigger is brewing. And for Eala, the signs were all there. She had the game, she had the record, she had, most importantly, the belief. What she needed now was the stage, and Wimbledon was about to give her the biggest one of her life. The 2026 Wimbledon Championships began the way most Grand Slams began for a player ranked outside the top 25. Quietly, without fanfare, one match at a time. Eala opened her campaign against Mexico's Renata Zarazua, and there was nothing hesitant about the way she played. She dismantled her opponent, 6-1, 6-2, a commanding, statement-making win that made her the first Filipino player in history to win a singles main draw match at the Grass Court Grand Slam. It was already historic. It was already something no Filipino tennis player, man or woman, had ever accomplished on that stage. And yet somehow, it was only the beginning. She continued to grind through the draw, her confidence swelling with every round. Then came the moment that would define not just her tournament, but potentially her entire career. A third-round matchup against Iga Swiatek, the defending champion, the reigning world number 3, a player who had already collected multiple Grand Slam titles and was widely regarded as one of the most dominant forces in women's tennis. On paper, it was David versus Goliath. Swiatek was supposed to win comfortably. She was the champion, she was the favorite, she was by almost every measure simply better positioned to advance. Eala was the 29th seed, facing the very player who had lifted the trophy the year before. Nobody was picking the underdog. But tennis, like all sport, doesn't always follow the script. And on July 4th, 2026, on center court, in front of a crowd that had come expecting to see history continue for Swiatek, it was Eala who wrote a different story entirely. The atmosphere on court was electric, tense, and increasingly disbelieving as the match progressed. Every point felt like it carried more weight than the last. This wasn't just a third-round match anymore. It was becoming something the entire tennis world would be talking about, whether Eala won or not. The tension built with every service game, every breakpoint saved, every rally that pushed both players to their limits. And then, finally, after a grueling battle, it happened. Eala closed out the match 7-6 in a tiebreak that stretched to 11-9 before sealing it 6-2 in the second set. The defending champion was out. The 29th seed had done what almost nobody believed was possible. It was the biggest win of her career. It was the first time in the Open era that a Filipina had reached the fourth round of a Grand Slam singles event. And in that moment, on that court, an entire nation's relationship with tennis changed forever. What happened after the final point was almost as remarkable as the match itself. Eala, normally composed and measured in interviews, could barely hold back her emotions. Standing before the crowd, microphone in hand, she let the weight of the moment wash over her completely. "Yeah, I'm really emotional," she admitted, her voice catching in front of the packed stands of center court. It wasn't a performance, it wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, unguarded honesty from a young woman who had just achieved something she may have dreamed about but never quite dared to expect. She went further, explaining what the moment meant to her, not in the context of rankings or trophies, but in the context of where she came from. She spoke about how, for some players, a win like this might seem small. For someone like Iga, who has won so many slams, or maybe someone like Serena or Venus, this achievement may seem minor in the grand scheme of their careers. But for a girl who grew up in the Philippines, training on ordinary courts with ordinary equipment, this was everything. She described her childhood in vivid, disarming detail, training with her brother and her grandfather every single day after school, wearing ruffled socks and light-up shoes, her cheeks still chubby with youth. It was a story that resonated far beyond tennis circles. It was a story about persistence, about humble beginnings, about a family that believed in a dream long before the rest of the world took notice. Back home, the reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. What started as a niche sporting interest exploded into a full-blown national phenomenon. Watch parties sprang up across the country, the largest gathering at Phil Sports Arena, where crowds packed in to witness her next match, the fourth-round showdown against Jasmine Paolini. Social media lit up with pride. News outlets that rarely covered tennis suddenly couldn't get enough of her story. This was Eala mania, and it had arrived seemingly overnight, even though in reality it had been building for years, through relentless training, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance far from any spotlight. The significance stretched beyond a single match or tournament. Eala had become the first Filipina seeded player in Grand Slam history. She had become the first Filipina match winner at Wimbledon. She was now etching her name into the history books in a sport where the Philippines had never before had a genuine contender on the world's biggest stages. But with history-making moments comes something else, pressure. And the very next opponent standing in her path was about to test everything she had just built. Every fairy tale run in sport eventually meets its next test. And for Eala, that test arrived in the form of Jasmine Paolini, the 13th seed, a 2024 Wimbledon finalist, and one of the most experienced big match competitors on the WTA Tour. If beating Swiatek had been the improbable dream, surviving Paolini in the fourth round was about to become the brutal reality check. There was no easing into this challenge. Paolini brought exactly the kind of composure and big match experience that comes from having already been deep in Grand Slam tournaments before. She had reached a Wimbledon final. She knew what it took to grind through pressure-soaked 5-set, or in the women's game 3-set, battles on the sport's biggest stage. For Eala, the challenge wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. How do you follow up the biggest win of your life? How do you carry the weight of an entire nation's expectations, built almost overnight, into your very next match against a proven, battle-tested veteran? The match unfolded as a genuine struggle. 3 sets of tension, momentum swinging back and forth, each player searching for the answer that would tip your balance. It wasn't a blowout in either direction. It was a fight, the kind that reveals character as much as skill. In the end, on July 6, 2026, Paolini emerged victorious in 3 sets, ending Eala's historic run at the fourth round, the deepest a Filipino player had ever advanced in a Grand Slam singles tournament. Eala walked off center court, waving to the crowd that had come to support her, visibly disappointed but not broken. There's a particular kind of heartbreak in losing right at the doorstep of something even greater. A quarterfinal spot had been within reach. A place among the true contenders for the title had been tantalizingly close. And now, instead of continuing to write history, Eala was left to process the end of a tournament that had already exceeded almost every expectation anyone, including herself, might have reasonably held. But this is where the story reveals its deeper truth. The fallout wasn't public backlash or controversy. It was something more human. The quiet, complicated feeling of falling just short after climbing higher than ever before. It's the kind of moment that separates athletes who crumble under expectation from those who use it as fuel. And for Eala, the numbers told a story that no single loss could erase. She had now beaten 7 top 10 players in her career. She would climb to a new career high ranking of world number 28. She had compiled an outstanding 12-4 record on grass that season alone, a surface once considered her weakness, now quietly becoming one of her strengths. In the immediate aftermath of defeat, it would have been easy for Eala to focus only on what she'd lost. Instead, in her post-match press conference, she offered something far more mature, a perspective grounded in growth rather than grief. "This week in general will add to my confidence," she told reporters, her voice steady despite the fresh sting of elimination. She paused, almost reflecting on the question as she answered it. "I mean, if this week doesn't, it's been one of my best results, right? Of course it will add confidence." She continued, articulating something that revealed the depth of her competitive mindset. "I think it's important that every match I played this week, and every match that I play, I go in with the self-esteem and the thought that I'm able to win." Those words mattered. They weren't the words of someone who viewed her tournament as a failure simply because it ended in a loss. They were the words of a competitor who understood that a fourth-round finish, against the backdrop of her career trajectory, represented genuine, undeniable progress, not a setback. Consider the scale of what she'd actually accomplished in a single fortnight. She became the first Filipina seeded player in Grand Slam history. She became the first Filipina match winner at Wimbledon. She reached the second week of a Grand Slam for the first time in her career. She defeated a defending champion and world number 3 in a match that will likely be replayed and referenced for years to come. And she did all of this while representing a nation that had never before seen one of its own compete at this level on tennis's biggest stage. The truth, then, isn't found in the final score against Paolini. The truth is found in the totality of the run, in a career-high ranking, in 7 wins over top 10 opponents throughout her career, in a 12-4 grass court record that transformed a perceived weakness into a genuine strength. Sport has a way of measuring success too narrowly sometimes, wins and losses, trophies and early exits. But Eala's Wimbledon story resists that narrow framing. It was a tournament that redefined what was possible, not just for her individually, but for an entire tennis culture in a country still building its footing on the world stage. This wasn't a fairy tale interrupted by heartbreak. This was a fairy tale that simply hadn't finished being written yet.